Greetings, Fitz Nation. How are you? Hope you're doing well. Brendan Fitzgerald here. I'm in the home studio in Las Vegas, as you can see if you're watching on UFC FIGHT PASS. Now, this is a different episode of Fitz Nation than we're accustomed to. Obviously, it's usually one-on-one interviews with a fighter or a coach or a personality in the world of mixed martial arts in the UFC. But I have had a long thought of doing a Q&A episode or series of episodes, considering that I am a forward-facing member of the UFC broadcast team. I hold an ESPN microphone on Saturdays, and I've been with the UFC for 6 years now. And so becoming a bit of more of a personality, and thought, why don't I do a Q&A episode, at least one, and maybe make it a regular thing. And to anybody who is a fan of this show and listens to this show regularly, I encourage you to reach out and ask me a question. What question do you have for me? And to do that, email me at brendanfitztv@gmail.com. If you have a question for the show, email me at brendanfitztv@gmail.com. There's a link in the episode description, and it's right there on your screen. And if you ask me a question that I use on a show, I've got so much swag around so I got some Fitz Nation stickers. Those are easy. But I got Panini UFC cards. If you're watching right now, you can see that's why I'm leaning away from my microphone. I've got 4-ounce gloves, the real thing, UFC gloves. And like this stuff kind of lies around and it collects a bit of dust on my shelf. It looks good in the background. I've got t-shirts. I've got UFC like sweatpants and hats and random stuff. And I always love giving them away to fans. Mostly in arenas. Like I'll show up early and I'll get, Bisping to sign a hat and then I'll give it to a fan, right? But if you're a fan of this show, then I owe you more than I owe somebody that I randomly meet in Kansas City. I'd like to give you the good stuff. And if you participate in the show and send me a question, brendanfitztv@gmail.com, and I use it on the show, then I'd be happy to send you something, and that would be great. Now, don't reach out to me on social media through direct messages because I might not get it, and that's for reasons I'll go into in a little bit. I'm going to talk about social media on this show. But let me talk to you about what I'm going to answer on this episode. These questions didn't come from fans of the show because I didn't put out a call to action on social media. Instead, I'm going to answer the question that I get asked the most from fans, and then I'm going to answer a couple of questions that I like to ask the most to fighters. If you listen to this show before, you know that I talk big picture life topics just as much, if not way more, than the nitty-gritty of being a UFC fighter or what it's like to be an MMA fighter. It's things that we can all jive with, right? Things that we're all trying to work on. Be better versions of ourselves. What habits are we trying to build? What habits are we trying to let go of? What are we chasing right now, knowing that it changes from week to week, month to month, year to year, depending on our life situation? So to recap, brendanfitztv@gmail.com for a question. I'm happy to send you a little bit of swag if I can. I got a bunch of stuff that's lying around, and if you participate in the show, then that's how I can say thank you. All right. First things first, the question I get the most often is, how did you get into broadcasting, or how did you get into calling fights for the UFC? Now, there's two different versions of the answer that I'll give you on this show, because some people are just genuinely curious as to how I made it to calling fights on the UFC. They might be just big UFC fans, and they just go, man, how did you get this job? Right? And they're not looking for it themselves. They have their career and they have their line of work and whatever they do, but they're genuinely curious. So I'll answer that first. The second part, and the second reason why people ask me that question is because they want to get into this line of work, right? If they're in high school, if they're in college, if they're in their teenage years and they're looking for a career and they love watching the UFC and they say, I'd like to call fights. There's plenty of you out there, and I know that, and because I was once that. And it seems like it was yesterday, but it was 15 to 20 years ago, now that I just turned 41 and celebrated my 41st birthday earlier in August. So I'll answer that second, and I'll give you the 3 things that you can do to kind of carve out a path in broadcasting if you want to one day be on ESPN calling UFC fights or calling whatever sporting event you might be interested in. Okay, I'll try to keep this first one brief because it's basically the career journey of how I got to the UFC, but I just get asked this question all the time. And I'll give you a bit of an analogy on what to compare it to in terms of the business. So I went to Ithaca College in upstate New York. I got a degree in broadcast journalism. I always knew I wanted to be a sports broadcaster on TV. The dream job has changed many times. I thought I wanted to be a talk radio host. I thought I wanted to be a sports anchor on SportsCenter. I thought I wanted to be a play-by-play announcer, but I did know that I just wanted to be in the world of radio, TV, streaming now, broadcasting, talking about sports. And so Ithaca College, journalism degree. Now, I get out of Ithaca College and I had a resume tape. And the way that the business works is you just send out your resume tape. And in my case, I wasn't trying to be an announcer for a minor league baseball team. I was trying to be a sports anchor on TV. So my first job in the business was actually behind the scenes in Phoenix, Arizona, 2007. And I was writing scripts for a news show and rolling the teleprompter, just kind of a go-getter, $10 an hour in the newsroom type of thing. Then my first on-air job was in Casper, Wyoming. I was the sports anchor at a local NBC affiliate in Casper, Wyoming. What do you do in Casper? Well, you talk about high school sports. You talk about the junior college sport that was in town. You cover rodeos, not a joke. You cover rodeos as if they're a sporting event. So I did that. That was about 2.5 years. Then I moved down to Texas. Covered a lot of high school football in the Brownsville, Texas area, Rio Grande Valley, way South Texas, down by Mexico and South Padre Island. Was there for another 2 years. I get a big break. I moved to Boston. I'm the local sports anchor at a Fox TV station in Boston from 2012 to 2014. Then I go network. I get a job with ESPN. I was on ESPNU from 2014 to 2017 covering college sports. So in 2017, I get laid off by ESPN. In April of 2017, it was when ESPN did one of those mass layoffs. The business was changing, as it still is, and they just had more layoffs and kind of are still going through them now. So I get caught up in that in 2017. And that, if you recall, is the start of Dana White's Contender Series. That summer of 2017, Dana White's Tuesday Night Contender Series, as it was called, was going to be launched in July, and they needed announcers for that show. John Anik had just taken over the beginning of 2017 as the number one play-by-play announcer. Goldie left at the end of 2016, just to remind you of kind of where the UFC was at that point. So after getting laid off, my boss, now still with the UFC, was looking at the layoffs and looking for broadcasters because they knew they needed announcers for the UFC. So he saw all these guys being laid off at ESPN. I was one of them. He reached out to me, scheduled an audition in June of 2017. And a few weeks later, I found out I did good enough on the audition where they're bringing me back for Dana White's Tuesday Night Contender Series. And that is ultimately how I got involved with the UFC. People ask me all the time, they're like, so are you a big MMA fan before? Were you into mixed martial arts? Did you call fights? Like, did you train? Did you whatever? None of that. I was a professional broadcaster that was, I'd like to think good enough to be a network level broadcaster. So much so where I got thrown in to an audition for the UFC, who was high level in terms of the world of mixed martial arts. And it just clicked. I fell in love with the sport right away. Loved calling fights right away. It was unlike any job I had ever had before. And so that is the story of how I got with the UFC for the people that are curious about the journey. And the analogy is that I was thinking about how to best explain it. Broadcasting, you can kind of think of it like school teachers. There's kindergarten teachers and there's like research professors at Harvard, right? There's like such a wide swath of, if you were going to be an educator, where you can go and how high you can climb, right? Because we all know that teachers don't get paid enough, but kindergarten, first grade, second grade at your local elementary school are making quite a different salary as a tenured professor at Princeton that has all this famous research and that's written 5 books. So in broadcasting, you can stop anywhere up that ladder. You can go to Missoula, Montana, and be the news anchor and be there for 40 years. Not going to make a lot of money, but maybe that's the level that you want to be at. Maybe you're from there. Maybe you have great camaraderie with your business and your co-anchor and whatever, and you're just like, Montana's home. I want to be a news anchor in Montana, and I'm stopping here, right? And then you have people like me who come along, and I'm like, okay, I'm in Wyoming. Show doesn't end here. I'm just getting started, right? And you want to keep working your way up the ladder. And my goal was always to be a network sports anchor on ESPN, calling the biggest sporting events that I could, learning, growing. Obviously, the money that goes along with it, just as it does when you're a school teacher and you climb the world of academia. So that's kind of how it works, where you can kind of dart around. Now, you're an elementary school teacher, then you're a high school teacher, then maybe you're a low-level college professor, then you work on a thesis, you write a book, maybe you start a podcast, maybe you're Andrew Huberman after a while, and it all started by being an educator, but in the end, you had the ambition and the growth to want to do that much more. So that's kind of the broadcasting ladder for me. Start small, always chase more, never wanted to stop along the way and say, hey, I'm a sports anchor in Boston. I'll be the sports guy in Boston for 25, 35 years, whatever. Then once I got to Boston, I was more of the mindset of, now I can go network. My next step will be ESPN. Now I'm at ESPN. I got laid off, still with the UFC, but the steps up for me are still there, and I'm not necessarily chasing them now because I've gotten the network level and have a good situation. But that's, for people that aren't familiar with broadcasting, I guess you can kind of think of it that way, where it's one industry. There's such a wide spectrum of where you can go and where you can land, and ultimately where you kind of want to chill once you get that job where you're like, this is good. I can have a good life here. I can raise a family here. I can do a lot with this salary and live the life that I want to live. Okay, now it's time for those of you who want to learn how to possibly get into the business, or are even have had the thought of, what would it take for me to call UFC fights, for me to be on ESPN. Here are the 3 things you should do and you should start at if you want to call network sports or be a network sports broadcaster. Okay, number 1, I tell people this all the time. I want to call UFC fights like you, Brendan. How do I do it? Number 1, you got to love the business of sports broadcasting more than any sport in particular. You got to love content. You got to love learning how to edit. You got to love the process of not being great on camera, but knowing that you're going to figure out how to be great on camera. The mechanics of how you should speak, the mechanics of how you should write. You have to nerd out on the sports broadcasting business more so than nerding out on, in this case, MMA. Or if you're a big football fan, football. You got to love broadcasting more than that sport. And I'll tell you why. Because there is no guarantee. Actually, the thing that I could guarantee you is you will not carve out your career almost definitely in a single sport like that. If you're going to get into the role that I'm in of play-by-play and pro sports broadcaster, you are going to have to do a lot of different things before you get to like your ultimate dream job within that specific sport that you wanted to call in the first place. Case in point, I grew up playing hockey, ice hockey. Loved it. Massachusetts, hockey, high school hockey, captain of the team, went to college, played 2 years of club hockey. The only jobs that I have applied for and gotten an audition for and been a finalist for in my career that I have not gotten were hockey jobs. If you told me when I was young, what's your dream job, or like what sport could you imagine like really being a sports broadcaster for that you would love? I probably would have told you hockey because I loved it the most. I, was a finalist for a job with the New York Islanders, didn't get that job. I was a finalist in that summer of 2017 after doing season 1 of Dana White's Contender Series with the NHL Network. Talk about like a dream job scenario, at least for me at the time. I didn't get that job. They gave it to somebody else, even though I was more qualified for that job than any job I had ever gotten before. So that's why I say, number 1, you got to love the world of sports media as much or more, and I would stress more, than any sport in particular. That's what'll get you to Wyoming to take that entry-level job to cover rodeos. Because I guarantee you, you're not going to be in it to cover a rodeo, but you will be in it because covering that rodeo and learning how to be on TV will put you in the running to get the dream job that you ultimately want. Number one, love of sports media more than any particular sport. Number two, I still think the old-fashioned way of going to college and getting a journalism or some sort of media degree is the way to go. Obviously, with the world of YouTube and podcasts, anybody on social media that builds an influence can then back their way into some sort of media career. It happens all the time. I shouldn't say it happens all the time, but it does happen. People that don't necessarily have broadcasting training, but become social media influencers or content creators or bloggers or writers or whatever. That can happen, but I don't think you should rely on it if you're going to take this seriously as a career. So I think you should look to going to, if you're young enough to go to school, right? If you're not, 35, family, kids, all that, and going back to school is kind of a bit of a thing. But if you're in high school and you're wondering what it takes to get to that level, 4-year degree is your best bet. Journalism or sports media, they have specific sports media programs. That is kind of the path that you want to choose. There are also programs like Connecticut School of Broadcasting, which is, I think you can even do some of those courses online. I think Full Sail was like an online university, and they had a program. It was like the Dan Patrick School of Broadcasting type of thing. You could do those too. Definitely do something like that. That's going to be a specific course study geared towards you getting into the world of sports media. I'll give you just a bonus on the school thing. I did not do this. I would recommend doing this if you're going to go to school for any sort of sports journalism, sports broadcasting program. Try to find yourself to a major college. What I mean by that is a college that has major sports. I went to Ithaca College, Division III sports. Our football stadium had 5,000 people. Wouldn't it have been maybe better for my career if I went to Georgia and I came out of college saying, I just covered the Georgia Bulldogs basketball team. I just covered the Georgia Bulldogs football team. They went to the college football playoff. They won the thing. They're preseason number one. They're in these games against Alabama and Florida and SEC. And the bonus to that is the SEC network and those conference networks, the ACC network has one, the Big Ten network, they tie in with those student programs. So part of it was for those SEC schools to link up with ESPN was, this is not just going to be great for our sports teams. This is going to be great for our students and attracting students who want to be sports broadcasters. Because guess what? When you come to the University of Florida, you can get in with the SEC network and kind of they always need like assistants or their studio is linked up and there's options there if you go to that sort of school. So that's number two, journalism or media degree, some sort of official course study program in the world of sports media. Bonus if you can make it a college that has major sports so that when you're covering things as an intern or as a college student for your college sports, radio station, TV, newspaper, whatever, online, it's with a major university. It gives you more real world experience in that regard. Okay. Number 3, you should always chase and you should always have a side media project that's outside of your official study. If you go to a 4-year school and you get a journalism degree, you're going to be in the classroom and you're going to be learning the rules of journalism, right? The X's and O's of that. What you should also be doing is starting a blog, a Substack of some sort, or a YouTube channel, or a podcast, or something like that. In the same way that this show, for me, started out as just like this side thing. I did not have to do this for my job at the UFC, but I liked interviewing people. I knew that UFC fighters had great stories. I wanted to do it more, so I started doing this show. And for like 4 years, it was a hobby, and now it's become a bit more of a thing, linked up with UFC Fight Pass. But I would always recommend a side hustle of sorts within the sports media world that you have passion about. And now it exists. If I was in Wyoming now and I'm doing the job that I don't really want to do, making little money, going to high school sports in Wyoming, but on the side, my ultimate dream job would be to be a UFC broadcaster. Well, there's nothing stopping me from on the side in that job in Wyoming, writing a Substack about UFC or doing a YouTube channel in the way that Michael Bisping does, where he makes short 8 to 10 minute videos weighing in on the latest news of UFC topics, MMA topics, combat sports topics. So have a side project that will help push you in the direction that you want to go, because that will help prepare you for any dream job scenario that you might have in the future if and when that does come along. Okay, so there you go. Number 1, love of sports media more than any particular sport. Number 2, some sort of official course study so that you can really be around people that are going to get you to where you need to go, and you're going to learn more about what you need to do instead of just trying to get momentum as a content creator online. Number 3, try to be that content creator online in your specific type of sport and your specific type of job that you want the most, right? Like if you want to be a writer, start a Substack. If you want to be on camera, on TV, start a YouTube channel. If you want to be more of a radio talk show thing, start a podcast. There we go. Those are the 3. Okay. I hope that at least answered a few questions for people out there. It was a bit longer than I expected it to be. Now we'll get into a couple of questions, and I don't want to make this show too long, so we'll get into just a couple of questions of what I ask fighters on the show. Like the questions that I tend to ask with regularity in different forms depending on the person's story. All right, so I phrased it like this. What are you trying to figure out? So what am I trying to figure out right now? Like what is that thing that's like I find myself putting thought into, trying to put together so that I can better work it into my schedule, live a better life, level up in my job, that sort of thing. What I'm trying to figure out right now to live a better life and be a better broadcaster, be a better kind of member of the UFC broadcast team, I'm trying to figure out the intersection of social media and being the best one can be. So, what I found is they are often at odds. And if you look at my Instagram from the last year or so, and if you go back a few months at least, like I was doing the content creator thing, right? Like I was really trying to make a lot of content almost at all times. Like whenever I'm at the apex, I was trying to get my phone out. What can I capture video of? And how can I turn this into content? And what can I clip for social media? And all those sorts of things. And quite honestly, I got a little burnt out. Because if you notice my Instagram now, it's just clips of my podcast. It's just interesting, shorter clips of my podcast. And I am walking around with the phone in my hand a lot less. And that's because, I don't know, this summer I was just doing a lot of thinking. I was listening to podcasts. I went home to Cape Cod where I'm from and just kind of unplugged from off the grid for a little bit. And if we all know that being present will lead to a happier life, well, then the phone in your hand and trying to capture what you can capture and then put it on Instagram, that is the definition of not being present with where you are and who you're with. That is the definition of the opposite, because what you're thinking is, how can I get this on camera so that I can post it, so that I can get a reaction from other people? And then if I get a reaction from other people, my following will go up and that will lead to other opportunities. So the problem there is if I am standing around with Daniel Cormier and I'm focused on how can I record DC doing something that's funny so that I can post it to my page on Instagram or YouTube Shorts or whatever, so that it does well because it gets a lot of likes and comments. And then I get a lot more followers and subscribers because I'm behind the scenes with DC doing a funny thing. And then if I do that enough, I will ramp up my following so that I'll have opportunities of more sponsorships. My podcast might get more listens, whatever. And I've decided that that's a bit too much of a trade-off where I want to do a lot less of that. What I want to do is great work at what lights me on fire the most. I have wanted to be a podcaster or some sort of talk radio host for like 15 years. It's not gone away. Like since I was in college, longer, let's call it 20 years. I have just had a love for wanting to be in this format, whether I'm talking to somebody else, whether I'm talking about the UFC, or whether I'm talking solo in this form right now, to try to make it the best I can be, to try to make the show that I host the best it can be. And then also, not just for my independent projects, but of course, the best I can be as a UFC broadcaster. That's number one. That pays the bills. The best I can be as the host of UFC On the Line. The best I can be as the host of UFC Breakdown with Saif Saud to make that show the best it can be. And what I've discovered is me being the best version of myself is at odds with me being the best version of my social media following self. And so it's got me thinking more about, like, I look at fighters differently now too, about like how they treat social media. And so that's what I'm curious about, is how much I can thrive while pulling way back on social media. Because what happened was, I've read books about you should delete all your social media accounts right now. And I've read books about social media really matters. It can make or break your career. And, I read a book called 1 Million Followers, and it has these examples of like these actors in Hollywood that had bigger social media followings, were not the better actor, got the part because the people in charge knew that they could push whatever they were working on that much more with a bigger voice. Think about it. I'm not, a big UFC analyst that carries a social media following of hundreds of thousands or millions of followers is going to get more opportunities than the one that has a following of 20,000, right? Because wouldn't you want the person pushing out their project to that many more people? And that is true. But at a certain point, you also have to flip the coin over and rely on your skill set and rely on the other side of why they would want to hire you. And the reason why I got hired by the UFC was because purely that I was a good enough broadcaster. Pure and simple. That's how I got with the UFC. I had next to no social media following back then compared to other voices in the TV world. And it was just pure. And I didn't really have I had no name value with MMA fans and UFC fans. I had no social following. It was all about how good I was when I put a headset on and I called fights. And that's ultimately what's carved out this path. And I also think that in some ways, if you're not trying to be the show, then it will also boost it will also help you, not because your profile is big, but because the UFC knows it's not the Brendan show. The brand is the show. The UFC is the show. I'm not on the microphone trying to take away from the show because this is who I am. And that's different depending on who you're talking about, right? Joe Rogan, it's Joe Rogan calling the UFC. When I call the UFC, it's a UFC event. Here's an announcer that's really good. So, you'll see me a lot less on social media on a day-to-day basis, like sharing stories and giving you behind-the-scenes things. You'll still see me in the version of this show, chopping up the most interesting clips and sharing them, at least for right now, because what I've decided is that, being engaging and engaging with the fans and kind of spending a lot of time on Instagram to see what's working and see what's getting clicks and see what's getting likes, it's not worth the trade-off of me being the best version of myself. That's what I'm trying to figure out the most, and that's kind of where I sit on that spectrum right now. All right. The other thing that I ask people a lot is, what have you learned recently? What is a life lesson that you've learned recently? And the social media thing kind of dovetails with that. But I guess what I've learned recently, and what I've been doing, is listening to a lot of Cal Newport podcasts. Cal Newport wrote the books Deep Work. He wrote Digital Minimalism. He wrote A World Without Email. Very good author. Covers like computer topics. He's a computer science professor at Georgetown. And he has a YouTube channel that's really good with all his podcasts, but he doesn't have any other social media accounts, never has. So he's a bit of a hero for me in that regard, from the last 8 minutes or so of what you can tell that what I've been talking about. But he has this great practice, which I've borrowed this summer and started incorporating in my life, of disciplines. And I asked this to Pat Sabatini in a recent episode. It was the first time I asked a fighter about it, and it's not going to be the last. What are your disciplines, right? It's not like what's your routine and what are your habits and like what's your ambition and what do you want the most? I asked him, what are your disciplines? Because when you break it down to what are your disciplines, what are the things that you do consistently, that when you don't do these things, your day feels off, right? We all have our things that we do. Coffee's the easiest example, I think, for the most amount of people. When you wake up and you don't have your coffee, something's off that day. If you get to noon and you're like, I never had my coffee because I had to rush out of the house for this, and that, and I never was able to stop and get one because I had to go to this meeting and I was late and there was traffic, you're going to feel off. And partly you're going to feel off from the lack of caffeine, but really what you're going to feel off about, I contend, they could have put decaf in that coffee, but it's really about the ritual and the routine and the discipline and the whatever. So what are your disciplines? And what I've learned recently is that your true disciplines will stick around and they will reveal what you actually want, not what you think you should be doing, not what you think will level you up in a certain area, but you're not really that passionate about it. Your disciplines will reveal what you actually want. And case in point, what I've been doing discipline-wise is, I think for the month of July, I got up and I worked out first thing in the morning, 30 minutes of cardio, kind of like a cardio, like a kickboxing kind of situation, because I can't go for a run because I got the baby monitor in the morning. But I did that, I think, like 28 out of 30 days in July or 31 days in July. And then in August, I went away for a week, so I wasn't able to do it when I went back home to see family in Massachusetts. But I've done it like every day but 2 that I've been home in August. And the discipline for me, I saw a video recently online, and it was somebody that just gave themselves a year to really change. And part of the reasons why I'm melting away social media is because when you try to juggle too much, you can't make progress in maybe the 1 or 2 areas that you really want to make progress in. What I want to make progress on is being as healthy as I could possibly be, and then professionally want to thrive and have the best career that I can have. So if I want to be healthy as I could possibly be, situation A, for decades to come, then I got to start incorporating some disciplines that I'm not going to break. And if it turns out that I don't want to be as healthy as I can be, well, then that's going to show itself, because that discipline is going to be near impossible to stick to. I'm not going to hit those workouts in the morning. I'm not going to eat the right things. I'm not going to drink enough water. I'm not going to do all these things that require discipline if it's not actually what I want. Turns out it is what I want, because when I've melted away the unnecessary to-do list that I put on myself through, I got to share something on Instagram, what am I putting out on YouTube, what content am I doing, how's my TikTok following, how's my Twitter following, all that sort of other stuff, that I have decided doesn't matter as much as being healthy. So what can I do to be healthy? Get up early in the morning, get my workout in before anything else comes and distracts me that day. So what I've really learned recently is that establish a discipline. Like sit there and write down maybe 3 disciplines that you want to abide by. And if you don't abide by them, that's fine. But that just means that maybe you got to examine what you think you want in your life. Because if you can't abide by the disciplines that what's going to take to get you there, then you probably don't want it. You probably don't want it as much as you think you do, right? Like if you want to play guitar, right? I would like to play guitar, but you can't find the discipline to sit down for 10 minutes a day to do a little guitar lesson or to strum a few chords. It turns out you like the idea of playing guitar, but you don't actually want to put the work in to play guitar. And if you want to be in shape and if you want to be healthy, but you can't wake up early and get that workout in, then you like the idea of being in shape, and that's great, and don't we all? But you're not doing the necessary things it requires to do. And so I encourage you, just as I have encouraged myself recently, to trim it down to just 2 or 3 things and find the discipline and establish that discipline over the course of 6 months or so or longer. And then you can start building on those disciplines to how else it's going to fit into who you are. Because, I think I think what's really important is to make progress in fewer areas instead of make little progress in a lot of areas. And I was finding out that I was trying to make progress in too many areas, and it's like almost everything was suffering. I don't think I was as good as a UFC broadcaster as I could have been. I'm not saying I was bad, but I could have been better, and now I'm on that path. I could have been, just kind of really pouring myself into the work that really matters and not worrying about the stuff online that doesn't matter. I could have been doing that. Now I am. And there's a freedom to that. There's a freedom, just like I talked about with Dean Thomas, when you figure out your life without alcohol, there's a freedom to going sober. There's just a freedom to something that you think you have to do, but when it melts away and you find that you don't need to do it, you don't have to do it, your life is just fine without it, there's this big freedom that opens up. So what I've learned recently is like, if you shed that stuff and you just focus on the disciplines, then you will feel more free and you will discover what you truly want to get out of life. So there you have it. One more crazy fact, because I was listening to a podcast and I'm about to read this book called The Comfort Crisis, written by Michael Easter. And he was a guest on Peter Attia's podcast. This goes along with being your healthiest self, right? And what I'm trying to do. If all of history started on January 1st, midnight January 1st of a given year, I'm talking about like the Big Bang, like the beginning of Earth history, basically, right? And you go through all of the history of the Earth, the entire Earth, and you get to when humans evolved, humans developed, right? All of human history would have started at 11:59 p.m., 11:59 and 33 seconds on December 31st. I just found that to be a crazy fact. So if that's the only thing you remember from today, 11:59 and 33 seconds on December 31st, before the end of the year. That gives humans 27 seconds of an entire year. That's how long we've been around. I'm talking caveman times. I'm talking beginning of human history. 27 seconds of a whole year if it started on January 1st. Crazy. Okay, so to recap, thank you for listening. FAQ, Fitz Answers Questions. I'll start doing this regularly if you guys like it. I'll just start doing it regularly. And if you'd like to participate and ask me a question, email me, brendanfitztv@gmail.com. I will send you something. I'll send you a pack of Panini cards. I'll certainly send you a Fitz Nation sticker. There's a UFC Fight Pass hat here. There's 4-ounce gloves, UFC. If you send me a question that I use on the air, if you send me your favorite fighter, then maybe I get them to sign that 4-ounce glove and I send it to you for participating in the show and listening. So, as I said, I never take your attention for granted, and I appreciate you sticking around for this long. I hope that you enjoyed my journey of my career to how I started working for the UFC. I hope that you also, if you want to get into sports broadcasting, can take some of those 3 steps and work with them. And I hope you were able to learn a little bit about your own life by learning about what I'm trying to figure out and what I've learned recently. And I hope that you ask me a question. So send me in one. And again, thanks for listening. Fitz Nation on UFC Fight Pass and wherever you listen to podcasts. I'll talk to you next time.